Tá. Você não vai tirar fotos? Vai, né?
Poxa, um pouquinho em cima da hora.
Uhum. Eu faço isso direto.
Oh, it's me.
You can start. Everyone's fine? Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Eric, and I think I will start here. Well, as you can imagine, I'm from Brazil. I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and you have a smile over there. But I'm not here to talk about my own experiences with our smile, but to talk about the different realities between an academic and a fandom view of Tolkien's writings in Brazil. You know, I'm myself a scholar, not properly in Tolkien, but in Celtic studies. But I also talk about Tolkien's views on Celticism on my PhD. And I'm a historian and sociologist. And what I did here was to make a kind of field research and also an historical one on how Brazilians tend to read Tolkien, actually. And there's a problem here.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Want me to get my computer adjustment hammer?
No, it's his Mac, so my personal computer is this one, of course. And
O que aconteceu?
So what I did here was to make a huge sociological analysis and historical background and how Brazilians react to the Tolkien writings for the past decades and nowadays. So, as I said, I am a historian and sociologist, and I can't talk about this subject without a proper sociological methodology or... Still room?
Yeah. Peri, abre a porta pra ele não ter ficado.
Without a proper methodology or being a historian, you know, I can just not be what I am. So, my presentation, my paper here is his title is Overhill and Underhill, and some questions I need to make for you at the end of this presentation, and I really hope that we can share our experiences together, because I will talk about Brazil, of course, but if this paper can help you to understand not only the Brazilian reality, but also your own realities in your local communities and countries, I'll be glad. And if you can share it with me, I'll be more glad. But, well, this title, Overhill and Underhill. So what are we talking here? Well, in the beginning of Tolkien's readings in Brazil in the 70s, almost nothing was known, not only about the author, but also about what we can call it now, Tolkien's legendarium. We can certainly say that it's not quite easy to trace a history of academic or fandom perceptions of Tolkien's works in Brazil. In fact, it looks like a journey with ups and downs, and that's the main reason why I call this presentation Overhill and Underhill. Because indeed, our Brazilian journey is surrounded by difficulties, misconceptions, but also good and fierce groups committed to make Tolkien a canon literature among Brazilians. Well, I may quote the first lines of chapter 4 of The Hobbit to illustrate my perceptions of it, because as the main title of this presentation may suggest, our Brazilian readers and scholars face some problems worth of dwarves and hobbits trying to reach the Lonely Mountain. And if I could compare in the same way, quoting, there were many paths that led into these mountains, and many passes over them, but most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. End in quote. Well, I'm not saying that our scholars in Brazil or fandom group leaders are wise as Elrond or Gandalf. Of course not. But I'm trying to say that they make mistakes and achievements, and those mistakes and achievements helped to build a large Tolkien community in Brazil. Some of them are very popular on the internet, and others more well known in academic circles actually. But they all contribute in a way to make Tolkien's writings popular and canon in Brazil, even when they're fighting for different sides and interpretation, which is quite healthy for academic purposes and also for fandom groups, I think. But to reach that point of our explanation, first we need to understand the very beginning of Tolkienism in Brazil, its different periods, and, of course, the different perceptions for scholars and the general public of readers. In the end, this is a sort of cultural and social memory analysis and of how a great literature figure attracts different feelings and social actions and interactions within a specific culture, in this case, our Brazilian culture. But in the end, I hope we can share our experiences together and we can compare our different experiences from different countries. Because there's a Tolkien memory culture in Brazil. It's one of the first things that I can ask. For us, Brazilians, not only as scholars or fans or something else like that, yes, there's a huge Tolkien memory culture in Brazil. Some sort of collective memory, multi-directional, that can make different perceptions of it. And that different perceptions are quite intertwined, and they are the main reason why we have very specific Brazilian Tolkien reading of the works. Well, the road goes on. And in the very beginning, there were few who actually read Tolkien in Brazil. The very beginning, I talk about the 70s. Some may find interesting to know that our first Brazilian edition of The Lord of the Rings came just between 1974 and 1979, divided in 6 books, published by Arte Nova, which means new art in Portuguese. And Arte Nova editors was a group with no official right to translate it. Yeah, we have our own unofficial translation in Brazil as well. And therefore with no acquaintance of the guide of the names or any sort of directions to translate it. The result of this work and the translation of 1976, The Hobbit, as well, was a very hard group of books known by a few fantasy addict people by that time and no more. Today those editions are very expensive for collectors in Brazil, and they're very funny translations because, you know, they have no idea what they do. That's the point. they translate some names with different strange things. For our Portuguese speakers, very funny things actually, and now they're more folklorical translation. No one actually read the Arte Nova translation. Well, by the 80s, the majority of Tolkien readers in Brazil was made by the Portuguese version of the books, from Portugal. And by that time, the first academic research was made as well. O Senhor dos Anéis, Estrutura e Significado. Calma down, I'll translate it, okay? The Lord of the Rings, Structure and Meaning by Lucia Lima Polacchini, a woman, in 1984. At the end of the decade, the now renowned translator Ronald Kirmes founded Helen Yerem and the Order of the South, the very first Tolkien society affiliated somehow in Brazil and also in Latin America. And therefore, the Brazilian fans became more and more organized in groups. And it's interesting to mention now that Ronald Kirmes is the oldest Tolkien society member in Brazil, and thereafter a real Tolkien reference in our country. Everyone who started to read Tolkien's writings in Brazil or to pursue any scholar or more academic view of Tolkien need to know Ronald Kirmes and his thoughts about it, because he was the first one, because he's a real master of tradition for us, and well, it's a very nice chap. But despite those initiatives, Brazilian readers lacked a very important thing: a proper translation in our language. And this began to change in the 90s when the first official translations came to be published by Martins Fontes editors, starting with the Humphrey Captain's biography in 1992, followed by The Lord of the Rings in 1994, and The Hobbit in 1995, and The Silmarillion in 1999. It was the way that I discovered Tolkien when I was 12 years old in Rio in 1999. Well, by the time, in 1997, the very first PhD thesis was written by Rosa Silva Lopes, entitled O Narrar Ritualístico em O Senhor dos Anéis de J.R.R. Tolkien, the ritualistic narrative in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Well, with the real Brazilian translations, we started to build up a large community in the end of the 90s, and of course, different fans from different parts of Brazil started to fight for representation, affiliations, and other minor stuff. Even sometimes I know each other, and it's still nowadays like that. But the advent of internet at that time was, in this specific case, a double-edged sword, because different groups started to gather large audiences just to be isolated in their own social bubble. And it seems like they're still looking for their own bubbles. But things are changing. I'm very, I have this hope that things will change. But it's from me personally. So we had groups being created. For example, the very informative and academic website and internet forum Valinor is still working today with a large archive with the very best texts in Portuguese language. They still run a forum. No one's uses a forum anymore, but the forum is still there. I think it's a very good piece of informational. If you want to look for old archive texts and so on, they had a good project, they started to translate the Tolkien's letters in the early 2000s, and large groups formed from Valinor forum as well. Besides Valinor, we have the STB, the Brazilian Tolkien Society, the White Council, promoting events in different parts of Brazil, and so on. That's the first groups, actually. It's really in the top, but the first groups using the internet. They now more at sleep, I think, but most of these persons from this group interact with other groups and they formed different communities, and internet changed it by the next 20 years, so they also evolved in different forms. Eventually, through the 2000s, those groups became more and more intertwined, and the explanation was, in fact, two distinct things. First, the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, a huge box office success in Brazil that helped to change a little the way how Brazilians watched fantasy productions, not only as a child stuff, but as a more profound and adult entertainment. That's one of our most difficult things to change in Brazil. Brazilians' perception of fantasy is still attached to a childish thing. We're trying to change it day by day. Second, the professionalization of the fan. That's a real Brazilian phenomenon. The professionalization of the fan who started to publish academic books, to study Tolkien at universities, and to promote it with a Brazilian way of reading Tolkien. Nowadays you have different symposiums, different groups in universities, and this professionalization is being responsible for organizing different academic events and symposiums, as I said, expos. Recently we had a large Hobbit expo in São Paulo, and it's very nice to commemorate Hobbit's anniversary. And even open classes in large Brazilian universities in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Translators like Reinaldo José Lopes and Gabriel Brum came for that background. And nowadays, they are responsible for the current translations of the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, the Tolkien letters, and so on. By the time the new books and translations arrived in bookstores, new fandom groups and scholars began to appear within the internet. Just to mention a few of them, the website and fan page Tolkien Brazil, who started with good reading guides, despite it now it's snobbish and biased supposed to assume nowadays. The YouTube channels Tolkien Talk, that the most watched and polyvalent channel in Brazil with a very interesting and diversified videos from videoramas to academic coverage of our events, and also O Bolseiro with some reviews. If you say O Bolseiro, the Baggins in Portuguese,
Oh, yes.
have almost 6,000 subscribers, and Tolkien Talk have now, they passed this number, have about 50,000 subscribers. Okay, have also here the website Tolkienista.com with texts from different authors, but organized by the Brazilian scholar Cristina Casagrande, who recently published one of the very best studies in Portuguese language about the friendship in the Lord of the Rings, and I may proudly say as a friend of mine is sitting here. And of course, the creation of two new Latin American smiles, the Toca, basically smile in Portuguese, in Rio de Janeiro, our own smile, yeah. And followed by Imladris in São Paulo, promoting public readings and everything Tolkien. Well, and that one here, the new translations from HarperCollins Brazil, I will come back from the subject, but it's very interesting because those books was translated by 2 years ago from now, and they're a huge success, really. And I'm very proud to say that the Fall of Gandalf, they launched in Brazil at the same time they launched here in UK. It was a huge event, all people gathered together, and it was very nice. Really, to be there. I think it's very nice to be in Brazil right now as a Tolkien scholar or Tolkien fan, because lots of things are happening. Well, that's there and back again. Contemporary questions of it. Talking about how this Tolkien community was built up through the past decades inevitably leads to a discussion about memory and the perception of Tolkienism among Brazilians. First, we need to define what kind of memory you're talking about here, and then we need to understand what kind of methods the scholars or the general readers use to define their perceptions. the first point we need to understand comes from the fact that the academic community of Tolkien scholars and the Tolkien general readers are intertwined. Both groups communicate among themselves and also produce a sort of communicative memory passing through them among the past decades. I've made this just to illustrate, but we have this huge collective memory that demands collective action. Both scholars and fandom groups make this collective action and produce some sort of identity. This collective memory produce multiple links with the past decades, the past Tolkien studies, or even the past among their own groups. And they produce two sorts of memory: a communicative memory, more generational, passed to member, from different generations, and also a cultural memory, more broad, and then they produce a more solid Brazilian identity or form of reading Tolkien. The first point we need to understand here comes from the fact that the academic community of Tolkien scholars and Tolkien general readers are intertwined, as I said, and both groups communicate among themselves and also produced a sort of communicative memory passing through them among the past decades. The communicative memory here is a kind of collective memory based on the historical experiences in a framework of individual biographies, but attached with the informal and everyday interactions incorporated in this specific case with their own experiences with the Tolkien literature, not only the personal reading of a Tolkien book, but also with book launches, public readings, free academic lectures, and we say free academic, lots of people can, because it's free. It's a thing that happens a lot in Brazil. And more recently, internet interaction with posts and live videos on social media. In Brazilian community, this kind of communicative memory is defined by two models, basically. The first, more linked with a generational and exchange of ideas, and a second one, closer to a specific and contemporary witnesses within a proper group committed to a specific activity, as a book club, role-playing games, video games, or music fans. They all are together. And together, both groups create a very Brazilian way of reading Tolkien, based on the reading of the text itself, but linking academic analysis with a good and popular humor, as we could see with the interactions between study groups, blogs, and several events taking part around our big country. And really, Brazil is big. At the same time, we can see a huge growth of Tolkien community on the past 2 years, and that happens because, as we already said, both academic and general readers groups seems to be intertwined from their own survival, and also because of the efforts of these groups to make Tolkien a more popular author in Brazil. Among those groups, we must agree that the new Brazilian editors of Tolkien's books, HarperCollins Brazil, took an important role nowadays. After all, since the new contract came along and new and more accurate translations are being published, new doors were opened for Tolkien readers despite being a Tolkien scholar or part of general public. The editors are promoting links among the more traditional fan-based groups, the YouTubers, and even the scholars, since their own translators are scholars themselves. And with that, more and more public is attracted to Tolkien's works. Just to mention an example, the past 4 Tolkien books published by HarperCollins Brazil reached the top 10 list of the best sellers in Brazil, a surprising status for a fantasy book in our country. Never happened before. And with that, I cannot say. But let's draw some conclusions anyway. The Tolkien deal future in Brazil seems bright. Future Tolkien readers will be well served with new academic publications, new books with also new and more accurate translations, and even a perspective of the history of Middle-earth publication in our country in Portuguese can be seen on the horizon. Really, they really are looking for it. But all those efforts rely on a solid communicative memory built up through the past decades and constantly reaffirmed with the close relationship between the Brazilian Tolkien scholars and the general public. Of course, there are some controversies. After all, nothing concerning humans and intellections is easy to comprehend. But despite a few dissonant and sometimes snobbish voices within the more fanatic groups of fans, the majority of Tolkien readers in Brazil seems to be aligned with a bigger cause. In other words, the future of Tolkien studies in Brazil seems to follow a reliable path. The past decade's history was the base for the development of a complex multi-layered Tolkien memory culture, both communicative and multidirectional, and forced but to assume a very Brazilian way of reading and interpreting this kind of literature. Tolkien could be labeled as the great generic form of fantasy literature that are outright reading taste, as Tom Shippers, and also in Brazil, but mostly because of the efforts of the Tolkien scholars and fandom groups who have been so solid and compromised with this large memory culture that surround Tolkien's works' receptiveness in our country. In comparison with, we have different academic events in Brazil, and fandom events in Brazil, but they all seem to go together, in those days. And here we have some banners, from a academic event we organized at my university in Rio de Janeiro, with the medieval department of history, and we gathered different academic to talk. From São Paulo, like Cristina Casagrande was there, Diego Clotal. They are very known Brazilian Tolkien scholars, and they went there to talk about their own works. The new translators, who are also scholars as well, was there to talk about their work and more. The main reason for this event was to make Tolkien a more academic and non-author itself, because lots of old scholars don't like to put Tolkien on their works. I faced this on my PhD thesis when I was debating Celtic, and I used Tolkien to debate this, and they just blocked me sometimes, and they repeatedly when I defend my thesis, why are you using it? Not some sort of fantasy, childish stuff. Of course not. It's very serious and canon, and you need to understand it. So there are lots of in São Paulo, like the symposium, and some academic lectures, like in private places, and also fandom, like book launches. Those two pictures are from our archive, and they're in different places in different times. This one is more recent. It's one of the launch for Beren Luthien. This guy dressed up as a Morgoth, and with this shining Cimaros on his cloak. And there's this girl here. It's actually a stage dance, and he's playing Luthien dancing. It's very nice. And this one is far more ancient. It's from 2003. And there's an event with costumes, cosplays and stuff, and it was very old now. I realized that. And, I may be here, but I was a 15 years old guy. But let's not talk about it. In comparison with English-speaking countries, of course, Tolkien studies in Brazil are still in their main beginning, but based on the wise advice come from the new Tolkienist scholars and their knowledge and memory for our well-established groups of fans, the future should be preeminent. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm here to talk a little later, or just send an email to us. I'll be here for you.